In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain for the stated purpose of freeing the Cuban people from the tyrannical Spanish colonial empire and to establish an independent Cuban republic. Yet the ironic result of that war was the creation of an overseas American colonial empire, with the acquisition from Spain of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, as well as the annexation during the war of Hawaii. Now, by the standard interpretation, this was our first and our last American experiment with overseas imperialism, what one prominent diplomatic historian, Samuel Flagg Bemis, labeled, quote, the great aberration. By this interpretation, the United States, being born in an anti-colonial revolt, opposed imperialism throughout its history, and in such statements as the Monroe Doctrine, sought to encourage anti-colonial Republican revolts elsewhere. Along with this anti-imperialism went a desire, as enunciated most clearly in Washington's 1796 farewell address, to remain isolated from the rest of the world and to sign no entangling alliances. Now, as with most historical myths, these contain elements of truth. But in reality, the United States was never as isolated and anti-imperialist as is commonly believed. Indeed, it has been a highly expansionist power, always involved with the rest of the world. Illustrative of the difference between the myth and the reality here is the fact that Washington, in the farewell address, never proposed isolationism, and as president, he never practiced it. He never even used the word isolationism or the expression no entangling alliances in his farewell address. The common belief that he did so is yet another myth. In this lecture, we will explore the realities as opposed to the myths of American isolationism and American imperialism. We do have a problem here, semantic one. Both isolationism and imperialism have multiple meanings, and we will need to clarify in this lecture what those different definitions are, which definitions Americans in the past used, and which ones we are using in this lecture. Now, clearly, the original 13 colonies that became the United States were founded in the 17th century as part of an expanding British Empire. And in the next century, they rebelled against that empire and its monarchical form of government. But that does not mean that they rebelled against the concept of empire. Interestingly, one of our first military acts in the Revolutionary War was the attempted conquest of French Canada in 1775 in an effort to make it the 14th state. That was an effort that ended in failure at Quebec at the end of the year. In the 1783 peace treaty ending the war with England, the United States acquired not only what had been the 13 colonies east of the Appalachian Mountains, but also the huge territory between those mountains and the Mississippi River. The Founding Fathers did not see the Mississippi as the final boundary of the United States. They often referred to the nation as, quote, our rising empire. Thomas Jefferson talked about this, quote, empire of liberty. What they had in mind was an expanding entity, but one that would not acquire formal colonies, colonies that might eventually rebel against them as they had rebelled against England. Instead, land that was acquired would gradually be incorporated into the Union on an equal political basis. First as an organized territory, then as a state, once an area had enough white settlers. This pattern was first established under the Articles of Confederation in the Northwest Ordinances of the 1780s. Those ordinances would serve as a model for American expansion across the entire North American continent over the next 50 years. And that expansion took place by both war and treaty. Treaty, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Florida, Andrew Jackson's invasion, followed by a treaty during the years 1819 to 1821. Texas, rebellion by settlers against Mexico in 1836, and annexation in 1845. California and the Southwest via war with Mexico, from 1846 to 1848. Oregon, by treaty, albeit with the threat of war, in 1846. And the Southwest Gadsden Purchase by treaty in 1853. There were also continued and consistent attempts to conquer and annex Canada from the War of 1812 onwards. And of course, all of this expansion was accompanied by dispossession of the Native American tribes who had inhabited the land. Now, Americans did not call any of this imperialism because of the political equality granted to settlers in the new areas as opposed to colonial status. In addition, Americans saw the entire continent as theirs by divine right, as can be seen in the expression manifest destiny in the 1840s. But others, Native Americans, the Spanish, Mexicans, Canadians, did not see it that way. They saw it as aggression, subversion, and imperialism. It's important to note that colonialism is not the only form of imperialism. There are other, more informal forms of domination, of one area over another and one people over another. In this regard, I think it's interesting to note that both the Southern secessionists, before and during the Civil War, and the populists of the Midwest and Great Plains, as well as the South in the 1880s and 90s, both the Southern secessionists and the populists defined their sections as economic colonies of the Northeast, despite the supposed political equality within the entire Union. Now, this expansion across the entire North American continent was hardly isolation, nor was the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, asserting that the entire Western Hemisphere was henceforth to be considered off limits to European colonialism, while it remained open to continued American expansion. Is that isolationism? Not unless one again uses the American belief in manifest destiny, this time to expand across Central and South America as well as North America. Nor was the expansion of American commerce throughout the world in the late 18th and 19th centuries isolationism. Commercial expansion with Europe, with Latin America, and with Asia, this would include the opening of Japan in 1854 and other Asian areas throughout the 19th century, were hardly moves of isolationism. Was there an American isolationism? Yes. But it was limited to non-participation in Europe's numerous military alliances and wars. Something many Americans had come to the United States to escape, and something they saw as being made possible by two factors. The first was what Jefferson had referred to in his first inaugural address, the fact that geographically, the United States was separated by thousands of miles of ocean from what he labeled, quote, the exterminating havoc of 1/4 of the globe. The second factor was the American belief that their expanded commerce was a way to avoid war, and that indeed it was a rational alternative to war. In reality, however, commerce could be, and often was, a cause of war. We can clearly see that in the American declaration of war against Great Britain in 1812 because of British violations of America's commercial neutral rights via seizures of American ships and goods, as well as the seizure of American citizens via impressment of sailors on the high seas. In point of fact, Americans viewed both this throttling of their commerce and simultaneous British support for Indian tribes in the Old Northwest as a conscious effort to halt the expansion of the United States, both landed and commercial, to throttle this new American empire and to destroy it. Commerce as a cause of war is also obvious in the declaration of war against Germany in 1917 for violation, again, of our commercial neutral rights on the high seas, this time via submarine warfare. And in retrospect, the major reason we did not go to war with a European world power in the 105 years between the end of the War of 1812 and our entry into World War I, Spain was hardly a major power in 1898. The main reason we did not go to war with a major power during this time period was the fact that British balance of power politics maintained overall European peace, and that precluded the emergence of any hegemonic continental power that could threaten us or lead to the outbreak of a general European war. Now, what about the war with Spain? Before we even get to the war with Spain, what happened to this expansionism? Well, sectionalism in the Civil War brought it to a temporary end during the 1850s and 1860s. But throughout the 1850s, numerous adventurers, known as filibusters, and supported by the U.S. government, attempted to conquer Cuba and portions of Central America. They failed, but the efforts were there. Within 2 years of the end of the Civil War, the United States had purchased the enormous Russian colony, which we know as Alaska. Interestingly, that is the first territorial acquisition by treaty that did not include a provision for eventual incorporation into the Union as a state. Alaska would be officially known as a possession, in reality, a colony. Then came the war with Spain in 1898 and the acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, as well as the annexation of Hawaii. Hawaii, where American settlers had a few years earlier overthrown the native Hawaiian monarchy. But much more extensive than this formal colonial empire was the informal empire that the United States created in Central America and the Caribbean in the aftermath of the war with Spain. That empire included protectorates over 5 nations in the Caribbean and Central America: Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. All 5 were nominally independent, but the United States controlled the economies, the finances, and the foreign policies of these countries, and it reserved the right to intervene militarily in each of them. And it did so. The pattern was first established in Cuba with the 1901 Platt Amendment. It was an amendment to a U.S. military appropriations bill. The Cubans had to agree to this amendment by treaty and add it to their constitution in order to get the U.S. Army off the island, the army that had helped to defeat the Spanish. The Cubans within the Platt Amendment had to agree not to incur indebtedness beyond their means and not to do anything else that might endanger their independence. They also had to agree to grant the United States a naval base, which became Guantanamo Naval Base, and to allow U.S. military intervention in the country. A year later, Cuba and the United States signed a commercial reciprocity treaty that linked the Cuban economy to the American economy in a dependent role. The way this was done was by granting Cuban sugar a lower tariff rate than the tariffs on sugar from other countries. What that did, of course, it allowed the Cuban sugar industry to prosper, but it reinforced the island's single crop economy and in effect made the entire Cuban economy dependent not only on sugar, but on a continuation of this lower American tariff, thereby giving the United States, in effect, control over anything it wanted in Cuba. Also, in 1903, the United States helped to organize and then supported a successful revolt in the Colombian province of Panama in order to obtain the right to build and fortify a canal through what was now an independent country. As Theodore Roosevelt famously stated, "I took Panama and let Congress debate it." Over the next decade, the United States would foist treaties similar to the Platt Amendment on Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, as well as Panama. and it would intervene militarily in each of them. The Cuban military interventions occurred from 1906 to 1909, 1912, and 1917 to 1922. Nicaragua, it was 1909 to 1910, 1912 to 25, and then 1926 to 1933. Haiti, 1915 to 1934. The Dominican Republic, 1916 to 1924. The United States would also exercise financial supervision over the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, which did not end until 1941 for some of these countries. Now, careful examination of the map explains why these nations, as well as Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii, became part of the formal and the informal American empire. Panama and Nicaragua held the two key potential routes for an interoceanic canal, what would eventually become the Panama Canal. Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico controlled the Caribbean approaches to such a canal. They were also vulnerable to a feared European military intervention because of their chronic indebtedness and instability. What about Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines? They were all stopping points for both commercial and naval vessels needing to resupply. Ships at that point ran on coal, and you needed to resupply your coal. There were coaling stations and stops for other provisions on the route across the Pacific to the fabled China market of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, the American policy of free trade, most clearly enunciated in the open door notes of 1899 and 1900 regarding China, also promised and often led to further commercial expansion and domination of other areas. Given the enormous size and power of the American economy by this time, free trade, meaning free of tariff barriers, would almost inevitably mean that American goods were cheaper than those of any other power. The United States could simply produce those goods more efficiently given its awesome economic size. And if the United States controlled trade with certain areas, it would give the United States control of nations in Asia and Latin America, which had much smaller economies. As a famous late 20th century history doctoral examination question in Great Britain posed the issue, free trade is the imperialism of the strong. Discuss. Now, continuation of this commercial expansion during the years between the two world wars has led many historians to question the supposed isolation of the United States during this time period. Now, the United States Senate did reject membership in the League of Nations. But, as we will see in a later lecture, it remained very actively involved in the world during the 1920s, signing numerous treaties and expanding its economy globally. Indeed, the American economy undergirded the entire global economy of the 1920s, and with it, the entire peace structure of that decade. Now, both the American economy and the global economy collapsed during the 1930s, and with them went the peace structure. And admittedly, what both preceded and what followed that economic collapse is what one historian has accurately labeled a mood of isolation. But once again, it was a mood limited to a desire to stay out of another European war. And the closer Europe came to war, the stronger that mood became. It would change dramatically in 1940 and 1941 when Nazi Germany conquered virtually all of Europe. And it would result in the permanent demise of any isolationism whatsoever in this country. Indeed, After World War II, the United States would emerge as the most powerful and influential nation in the world, and indeed in world history. But as this lecture has hopefully shown, the shift was not nearly as dramatic as our national mythology would have us believe. Our past isolation has been grossly overstated, as has our anti-imperialism. Now, given this history, why have most Americans continued to maintain that we were once isolationist and almost always anti-imperialist? Partially, it stems from the fact that we successfully rebelled against the greatest empire in the world and thus believe we have an anti-empire tradition and history. Partially, it stems from the fact that our founders defined our empire, in Jefferson's words, as an empire of liberty, not an empire of tyranny, and we tend to equate the word empire with tyranny. Partially, it stems from the 19th century belief via the ideology of manifest destiny that the North American continent was ours by divine right. And thus our claims were superior to any contrary claims by Native Americans, Europeans, or Latin Americans. Our expansion by this mode of thinking across the North American continent could not be considered imperialistic. Along with that mode of thought went the belief that the entire Western Hemisphere was separated from Europe not only by an ocean, but by the Republican form of government. The 1823 Monroe Doctrine was and still is consequently perceived as a defensive document against European encroachment, and thus isolationist and anti-imperialist rather than expansionist and aggressive as others have interpreted it. Similarly, we believed we were liberating the Cubans in 1898. We also believed we were both defending and spreading freedom and democracy against mortal threats in World War I, in World War II, and in the Cold War. And partially, our belief that we were anti-imperialist stemmed from the fact that we equated imperialism with formal colonialism, rather than viewing formal colonialism as but one form of imperialism. In addition, we have always viewed trade as a rational alternative to empire and war, which it can be, but which it often, as we have seen, is not. Now, a debate did begin during the Cold War as to whether we were indeed an empire. And if we were, then what kind of empire? That debate accelerated after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. It was clear from that point on the United States was the hegemonic power of the world. So were we an empire if we were the hegemonic power? To most Americans, the answer remained definitely no. We are not an empire. Our major foreign policies, we are told consistently, are and always have been protection of our own security and promotion of democracy around the world, not the creation of an empire. But in the name of protecting our own security and promoting democracy, numerous critics point out that we have created and we consistently use the largest military force in the world. It is a military force whose total cost is greater than that of the armed forces of all other major nations combined. If that is not imperialistic, the critics asked, what is? There's another fact to consider. Isn't promotion of American-style democracy imperialistic to cultures that do not share or want our democratic values? On the other hand, isn't much of our previous expansion really the unplanned defensive result of our need to counter mortal threats to our security. Mortal threats that appeared first in the shape of aggressive European monarchies, and then in the shape of Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union. Perhaps so. Perhaps so. But that does not negate the domination we have been able to exercise over others in the process of defending ourselves and ensuring our own security. And others clearly define that domination as imperialistic. Now, in truth be told, in a world of nation states that all claim sovereignty, and keep in mind that sovereignty includes the right to make war. In such a world, the only absolute security is expansion designed to preclude the emergence of any other center of power that could threaten you. Clearly, during the Cold War, that is the way we interpreted Soviet behavior, and in fact, all of Russian history. Realize that in this regard, one nation's defense is another nation's aggression. And that will be the case as long as we live in this anarchic international system, in which every nation maintains that it is sovereign and maintains the right to make war on any other nation. Perhaps relevant here is what the ancient Athenians asserted to the Spartans 2,500 years ago about their empire, that is the Athenian Empire, at least according to Thucydides in his classic, The Peloponnesian War. The Athenians said to the Spartans that their principal motive in acquiring an empire was fear. Then Thucydides added, quote, though honor and interest afterwards came in. Are we all that different from the Athenians? Or indeed, are we all that different from ancient Rome, to which we are often compared by others, and indeed, to which throughout our history we have often compared ourselves? Many Americans, whether liberal or conservative, trace contemporary liberalism back to the late 19th and early 20th century reform movement known as progressivism. Progressivism was a movement that began in the cities and that came to dominate both political parties and national politics during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Indeed, at least 2 American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, openly identified themselves as progressives and their programs with the progressive cause. Yet a close examination shows that the progressives held many views totally repugnant to contemporary liberals. Now, as with other historical myths that we've looked at, there is a kernel of truth in the supposed connection between progressivism and contemporary liberalism. But it has been grossly overstated, and it distorts the history and meaning of progressivism. It also distorts the meaning of contemporary liberalism and contemporary conservatism, for that matter. Part of the problem is that our definitions of liberalism and conservatism have changed rather dramatically over the past century, and they have done so more than once. But the problem is also due to a misunderstanding regarding who the progressives were and just what they stood for. This lecture will attempt to address that misunderstanding by analyzing the progressives and their progressive movement. After doing so, it will then explore the ways in which progressivism is related to contemporary liberalism and the ways in which it is not. Now, the confusion over progressivism is quite understandable. It was never a unified movement. It contained many different groups with many different goals. That fact is clearly illustrated by both the legislation that was passed during the Progressive era and the 4 constitutional amendments that were passed during this time period. These constitutional amendments, numbers 16, 17, 18, and 19, established the income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition on the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and the vote for women. Now, what in the world, one might ask, do those 4 have in common? Situation is similar in regard to progressive legislation. Major progressive bills included establishment of the first income tax, bills to regulate the railroads, antitrust legislation, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, major attacks on civil liberties during and after World War I, and immigration restriction. Again, one might ask, what in the world do these have in common? The Progressive era would also see the creation of numerous professional organizations with enforced professional standards for doctors, for lawyers, for others. It would also see the rise of social work, social workers, settlement houses to help the immigrants and the poor. We will also see the rise of a national birth control movement during this time, a further deterioration in the condition of African Americans, a major movement in the churches known as the social gospel movement promoting progressive reform, and a racist eugenics movement that sought to sterilize those it labeled inferior. Once again, what in the world do these have in common? The movement also elected 2 of our best-known presidents, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. But they came from different political parties, and they had strikingly different personalities. They ran against each other in 1912 on 2 progressive platforms, but diametrically opposed platforms, and they came to hate each other. The progressive movement also included people famous in other areas of American life, but with little, if anything, in common. You had philosophers such as William James and John Dewey, the father of our modern educational system. You had social workers such as Jane Addams, who was also a famous peace activist. At the same time, you had Army officers such as General Leonard Wood, who helped bring progressive efficiency to the Army and who wanted to inculcate Army values into the civilian population. You had ministers such as Walter Rauschenbusch and Washington Gladden, who were leaders in the social gospel movement. You had jurists such as Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, highly influential Supreme Court justices who came from different generations. You had expose journalists called muckrakers by Theodore Roosevelt, such as Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell. And you had novelists such as Stephen Crane, Theodore Dreiser, Frank Norris, Jack London, Upton Sinclair. You had imperialists such as Theodore Roosevelt and anti-imperialists such as Robert La Follette. Roosevelt was also an avid internationalist, whereas La Follette is known as an isolationist. Nor is that the end of the contradictions and the confusion. Progressive programs included many ideas from the 1892 populist platform cited in a previous lecture, but most progressive leaders had been anti-populist in the 1890s. Most progressives wanted to regulate big business, but numerous business leaders were part of the movement. Many immigrants supported the movement, even though many of its leaders were anti-immigrant. Many African Americans supported the movement, even though many of the movement's leaders were highly racist. And many women supported the movement, even though many of its leaders were proponents of legislation to protect women because of their alleged inferiority. Now, historians have for many decades explored progressivism and tried to understand these contradictions and this movement. Perhaps it is best described, in the words of one historian, Robert Wiebe, as a search for order, an attempt to redefine American politics and American society in light of the revolutionary changes that had been created by the Industrial Revolution and the ensuing urbanization of the country. In this regard, a new class of urban white-collar professionals created by the Industrial Revolution and urbanization, accountants, clerks, mid-level managers, would join with the older urban professional middle class of doctors, lawyers, and businessmen to be two of the driving forces in the movement, though far from the only ones. Now, the essential progressive program focused on a series of general goals. One was to end the abuses of power and the corruption that had come to dominate American economic and political life. Progressives wanted to replace corrupted institutions with reformed ones that would restore power to the people via such measures as the initiative, so that the people could initiate legislation rather than the corrupt state legislatures, the referendum where people could vote directly on this legislation, and the recall whereby corrupt officials could be thrown out of office before the end of their term. Progressives also favored direct election of senators instead of via corrupt state legislatures, the secret ballot, and extension of the franchise to many previously denied it. Progressives also wanted to restore morality to American politics and American life. Honesty in business, honesty in government, honesty in production. Witness the Pure Food and Drug Act. Progressives wanted to help the victims of industrialization, children and women forced to work, the new immigrants, and others. Progressives wanted to use scientific and efficiency principles and expertise from both the academic world and the business world to minimize disorder and establish cooperation. In progressive minds, expertise and morality were fused. They were not contradictory, they were complementary. As Woodrow Wilson once said to the experts that joined him going to the Paris Peace Conference, a group known as the Inquiry, "Tell me what is right, and I will fight for it." The experts would know what was right, what was morally right, as well as what was factually right. Progressives also wanted to professionalize and regularize aspects of American life by establishing clear standards for doctors, lawyers, and other professionals. And finally, progressives wanted to restore a sense of discipline, virtue, and service, to get people to look beyond their narrow self-interest and look instead to the good of others and to the good of the country as a whole. The thought was best expressed by the philosopher William James in his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War. War, he believed, was hideous, but it did get people to think not first of themselves, but of the soldier next to them, beyond their own self-interest. If we could get the civilian population to think the way soldiers do, James said, it would be a great advance. General Leonard Wood felt similarly. He called for inculcating military virtues into civilian life. Now, for progressives, the key tool to do all of this was positive government action. This is the key shift in what we might call the liberal perspective, and the one very clear link in fact, some would say the only clear link between the progressives and contemporary liberals. A belief that government is not the problem, but the solution to the problems that plagued American life at this time. Now, traditional 18th and 19th century liberalism feared government power. It saw government power as the key source of tyranny throughout history, and it had sought to limit government power in whatever ways it could. Witness in this regard the policies that we have previously discussed of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. But progressives turned this traditional liberalism on its head by arguing that the large monopolistic corporations and the corrupt urban political machines had become the key problems, and that positive government action was now imperative to control big business, to reform the political and economic systems, and thereby to restore and save the American dream. Now, there is no central theorist for the movement, but one of the most important progressive thinkers was an individual named Herbert Croly, who wrote a book entitled The Promise of American Life. What Croly essentially did was to attack Adam Smith's hidden hand that laissez-faire would result in everything being rosy. The marketplace, he argued, was no longer self-regulating, and it was not leading automatically to better things in the economic sphere or in any other sphere. The belief that it was, Croly maintained, was actually helping to destroy the American dream. And what was needed to restore the promise of American life was greater government power, nationalization, centralization. Or as one cliché to summarize the progressive movement put it, use Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends. Now, while progressives tended to agree on these general goals and the positive use of government, they disagreed over just how government should be used. For example, should it be used in terms of regulating big business to break down large monopolistic corporations, to smash big business, or should it instead merely seek to regulate them? This fact can be most clearly seen in the competing progressive platforms of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the presidential election of 1912. Wilson's New Freedom sought to use the government to break up big business in order to restore competition. Roosevelt's New Nationalism argued that this was both impossible and counterproductive. Instead, government should seek to control and legitimize big business. Government should also play the key role as arbitrator in differences between business and labor. Now, far from accidentally, this indirect attack on laissez-faire also led the New Nationalists to propose legislation to help the victims of industrialization, since these people in effect recognized that laissez-faire was not working and that some people would need government help. Now, those who opposed the progressive call for positive government action would henceforth be considered conservatives. But in actuality, they were retaining one of the major principles of 18th and 19th century liberalism: fear of government power. In that belief, these American conservatives were diametrically opposed to traditional European conservatives, who favored strong government power. Indeed, some favored absolute government power. It is important to realize in this regard that American conservatives and liberals both based their belief systems on John Locke's concept of the social contract, as was discussed in an earlier lecture. So do those who consider themselves neither conservatives nor liberals, but moderates. None of them follow the concepts of Thomas Hobbes and other European conservative thinkers that underlay the very different European definition of conservatism. Hobbes had maintained that the natural, original state of human life was, in his words, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. and that the only way to organize a society so as to overcome this was to give total power and obedience to a monarch or to a small aristocratic group empowered to decide every issue. Now, while some American conservatives just might agree with Hobbes's pessimistic view of human nature, they do not agree with his proposed solution of absolute obedience to a powerful, centralized, authoritarian government. Instead, they argue, as did 18th and 19th century liberals, that strong centralized government, not big business, remains the greatest threat to freedom. This fear of big government has led to the crack that an American conservative is actually a worshiper of dead liberals. If that is true, does that make a liberal a worshiper of dead conservatives? It is also important to note that while the logic of progressive thought does lead to many programs contemporary liberals could support, it also led to many programs that are anathema to contemporary liberalism. Let me name but a few of these. A desire to help the victims of industrialization, which contemporary liberals would applaud, combined with the desire to restore morality to American life, translated during this time period into an imposition of middle-class American morality via legal social coercion in numerous areas. Some have argued that that is something that contemporary conservatives might support as well. Another link of conservatives to the progressive movement. The Prohibition Amendment, as well as laws against certain drugs that were passed during this time period, were partially justified on the grounds that alcohol and drugs are immoral and that they create dependency that holds back the working class. In this mode of thinking, social reform becomes social control as the government assumed functions previously performed by the church, by the family, and by the local community. The desire to help the victims of industrialization would also lead to a major movement to Americanize the new immigrants at the expense of their traditional cultures. Now, destroying traditional cultures may seem to us as anything but helpful to new immigrants, but that is because our values in this regard have changed so dramatically over the last century. Today, our belief in this regard is aptly summarized by Star Trek's prime directive: not to upset or alter the cultures of other life forms with whom the Enterprise comes into contact. But the belief then was that the best thing you could do for the new immigrants was to make them think and behave just like middle-class white Americans. Furthermore, the progressive emphasis on science, on expertise, and on professional standards actually hurt the new immigrants and other poor by depriving them of the doctors, lawyers who had been willing to serve them. While those individuals might not have been very well trained, at least they were willing to provide service to the poor. Similarly, progressive efforts to destroy political corruption deprived the new immigrants and other poor of the urban political machines that took care of them, in return, of course, for their vote and acceptance of the graft that went with these machines. Tammany Hall's George Washington Plunkett had admitted years earlier to a reporter that he knew every man, woman, and child in his district, and when there was a fire or some other emergency, he didn't ask questions as reformers would, get them to fill out forms. Instead, he found them a place to live, got them clothing to replace what they had lost, and they gratefully repaid him with their vote. The fusion of science with pre-existing racism would reinforce the desire to help the new immigrants by Americanizing them and destroying their native cultures. It would also lead to immigration restriction to prevent any more of these inferior peoples from coming over and competing with American labor. That fusion of science with pre-existing racism would also lead to the rise of a movement known as eugenics, and with it, calls for forced sterilization of inferiors so as to improve the genetic base of the population. Indeed, this progressive era might very well have been the height of scientific racist thought in this country. It would witness in this regard the publication of Madison Grant's notorious Passing of the Great Race, soon followed by Henry Ford's previously cited anti-Semitic tracts. Nor is it accidental in this regard that the great progressive Woodrow Wilson would expand segregation in the federal government, introducing it to several departments where it had not existed before, and that he would praise D.W. Griffith's racist film, Birth of a Nation, as, quote, history written with lightning. Now, this racism, along with the emphasis on the imposition of American middle-class standards of expertise and morality, would also lead many progressives to become avid imperialists in the name of what Rudyard Kipling had popularized as the white man's burden, the need to help these inferior peoples by ruling them. It is no accident in this regard that the progressive era coincides with the establishment, as discussed in the last lecture, of the informal as well as the formal American empire. In fact, most of the military interventions in Central America and the Caribbean occurred during the progressive era, under both the Republican Theodore Roosevelt and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. And the progressive emphasis on nationalism and centralization would reinforce, if not create, the suppression of civil liberties during World War I in the name of patriotism. It was done via creation of the first American Propaganda Bureau, the Committee on Public Information, and the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts in 1917 and 1918. Those laws virtually outlawed dissent against the war and criticism of the United States government, and they would be supported by the Supreme Court. Indeed, Eugene Debs would be jailed again under these laws, this time for opposing the war. In addition to all of these problems, much progressive legislation simply failed. Big business today is in many ways more centralized and destructive of competition than it was 100 years ago. Big government has in many ways failed as well, failed to do what it promised, and to many today, whether rightly or wrongly, big government appears worse than the problems it originally grew to address. Fascinating is the fact that progressive political reforms would coincide with a decline in the percentage of Americans who vote, not an increase as the progressives had desired and expected. Nevertheless, progressivism created much of the broad value structure that we live with today, whether liberal, conservative, or in between, regarding such issues as efficiency, expertise, morality, government control, as well as the inculcation of such values through our educational system. We still use the word progressive. In this regard, we are in a situation similar to the continued use of the word populism. Do contemporary people who use the label progressive have anything in common with the original progressive movement? The answer is probably similar. This is not a lecture on contemporary progressivism, but as with populism, there are links, but there are dramatic differences. What I think can be clearly stated is that most, if not all of us, liberals, conservatives, moderates, progressives, remain linked to progressive ideas. And progressivism thus remains very relevant to contemporary American life. But it does not necessarily remain relevant in the ways that we think it does. Woodrow Wilson is one of the most controversial presidents in all of U.S. history. In most presidential polls, he is put in either the great or the near great category. Yet to his numerous detractors, both at the time and later, he is vastly overrated. Now, examining the reasons for this sharp difference of opinion provides an opportunity to explore the broader issue of presidential ratings in general and the standards by which past presidents are judged. Wilson's reputation and high rating in the polls rests upon what appeared to be an extraordinary series of accomplishments during his 8 years in office. A former professor of political science and then president of Princeton, Wilson possessed exceptional intelligence, knowledge, and rhetorical abilities. He used these to promote and obtain passage of his New Freedom progressive program. This included, during his first 2 years in office, the Underwood-Simmons tariff, which was the first major downward revision of the tariff since before the Civil War. It also contained the first income tax in American history. Congress also passed the Federal Reserve Act, establishing the Federal Reserve System. This was our first central banking structure since Andrew Jackson destroyed the Second National Bank of the United States in the 1830s. Congress also passed the Federal Trade Commission Act, which established the Federal Trade Commission, and the Clayton Antitrust Act to curb monopolistic business practices. But that was not the end of it. Wilson then expanded his reform program so as to obtain passage in 1916 of a second round of progressive legislation. You had the Federal Farm Loan Act and Warehouse Act to provide farmers with credits, a Highway Act to help construct and improve rural roads, the Owen Keating Act prohibiting the interstate shipment of goods made with child labor. You also had the Adamson Act, establishing an 8-hour day for railroad workers, and the Kern-McGillicuddy Act, which created a workman's compensation system for federal employees. That's impressive. And in obtaining this collection of progressive legislation, Wilson also became the first president to propose and obtain from Congress a full program. He was also the first president to address Congress personally and use his rhetorical abilities to get what he wanted, since George Washington and John Adams. Thomas Jefferson had ended that practice. Wilson also exhibited exceptional political skill, both with the Congress and with the public. And by 1916, he had united progressive forces from both parties to support him for re-election. In foreign affairs, Wilson's supporters argue, he kept the United States out of World War I for nearly 3 years. And when forced by German actions to enter the war in the spring of 1917, he quickly became the moral leader of all the Allied nations and the major force for reform of the entire international system. That reform program, as enunciated in his 14 points address and other major speeches, focused on creating a new world order, a world order to be based on the creation of a League of Nations and the principle of collective security. In the past, peace had been maintained by the balance of power. And that balance of power had failed numerous times, most obviously during World War I. Wilson argued that the world should now ditch the balance of power and replace it with an international institution, the League, and a system whereby all nations would unite to stop any aggressor state. This would be collective security. Now, Wilson obtained his League of Nations and much of the rest of his international program during his intense negotiations with Allied leaders in Paris. But he failed to obtain Senate ratification of the ensuing Treaty of Versailles. According to his supporters, That was because of Republican obstructionists and because of a major stroke that tragically prevented him from successfully mobilizing the American people in favor of the treaty and membership in the League. Wilson had undertaken a tour of the country to mobilize support and suffered the stroke in the midst of that tour, forcing him to cancel it, return home, and in effect, no longer act as the president he previously had. Now, despite this final failure, Wilson's supporters argue that his record of achievements is extraordinary. He brought the progressive movement to its zenith. He helped to redefine the role and the power of the presidency and the federal government as a whole, and he redefined the role of the United States in the world arena. Even his failure to obtain Senate agreement to join the League of Nations boosts his reputation, according to these supporters, by clearly illustrating that he was simply ahead of his time. For in 1945, the United States would join the successor to the League of Nations, the United Nations. Now, Wilson's critics see a very, very different record and reach very different conclusions. For a start, although Wilson carried 40 of 48 states in 1912 and won a massive victory in the Electoral College, he carried the Electoral College 435 to 96. The popular vote was another matter. Wilson is a minority president. He ran against Taft on the Republican Party and Theodore Roosevelt on the third party known as the Bull Moose Party. When the vote was counted, Wilson had obtained only 42% of the popular vote. Wilson also ran in 1912 on a very limited New Freedom Reform program, the critics argue. A program designed essentially and limited to destroy the trusts and restore competition. Yet soon after taking office, he abandoned portions of that program, and by 1916, he had embraced the much broader yet diametrically opposed New Nationalism reform program of Theodore Roosevelt, with his emphasis not on destruction but regulation of big business and on economic and social welfare legislation. Wilson had opposed all of this in 1912. Why, the critics argue, did he do so? Did he now change? Primarily to obtain the votes of Roosevelt's 1912 supporters and thereby achieve re-election. Critics also note that Wilson refused to support women's suffrage and that he was responsible for bringing added racial segregation to the federal government. In foreign affairs, critics note that this supposed anti-imperialist wound up intervening militarily in Latin America more than his openly imperialist predecessors combined. He sent troops into the Dominican Republic, into Haiti, into Mexico. He maintained troops in Nicaragua that had been sent there by his predecessor, William Howard Taft. His military intervention in Mexico almost resulted in a war with that country. What about World War I? Critics point out that Wilson was so pro-Allied in his sympathies and his actions that he made a mockery of American neutrality in World War I. He held Germany to much stricter standards than the Allies regarding violations of American neutral rights. In fact, those stricter standards led to the resignation in protest of his first Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. And by allowing extensive war trade and loans to the Allies, Wilson effectively made the United States an unofficial belligerent whom Germany was more than willing to attack in 1917. Along with his diplomatic blundering and blindness, this behavior eventually forced Wilson into a war he did not want and one he both could and should have avoided. Once in the war, the critics continue, Wilson's administration amassed almost dictatorial powers. It also established America's first propaganda bureau, the Committee on Public Information, and virtually outlawed dissent with the Espionage and the Sedition Acts. These initiated a period of severe government repression and some of the worst violations of civil liberties in American history. Wilson also participated in the Allied military intervention that attempted but failed to overthrow the Bolshevik government in Russia. And he refused to recognize that government for the duration of his term. In fact, the Bolshevik government would not be recognized until 1933. These moves embittered relations between Russia and the United States for decades, and they were an important factor in the development of the Cold War. At the same time that all of this was going on, the critics note, the Wilson administration attacked domestic and immigrant leftists, and soon after the war, it launched what became known as the first Great Red Scare. Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, launched what are now recognized to be the totally illegal Palmer raids, the arrest of numerous American citizens, as well as immigrants, and the deportation of some of them. After World War I, the critics continue, Wilson also proved to be a very inept negotiator at the Paris Peace Conference. And in the end, he abandoned many of the lofty principles he had previously championed. The primary cause of Senate refusal to ratify the League of Nations and Treaty of Versailles, these critics maintain, was Wilson's own arrogant refusal to compromise with Senate Republicans, a refusal that doomed the treaty and that one historian has labeled, quote, the supreme infanticide. And that refusal, along with the defective Treaty of Versailles for which he bore so much responsibility, led to a second and bloodier World War only 20 years later. This is a record of overwhelming failure, despite all the lofty rhetoric. As one notable progressive put it at that time, he gave us nothing but words. Even those words are suspect, for in both domestic and foreign affairs, he championed 19th century concepts that would be unworkable in the 20th century. Well, how does one deal with these diametrically opposed conclusions about Woodrow Wilson in assessing his presidency? And what can they tell us about presidential ratings and presidential polls in general? Such polls, usually of historians and political scientists, have taken place numerous times over the last 65 years. One of the primary standards used in such evaluations is, and should be, the consequences of presidential actions. By that standard, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt always rank as the top three presidents. Washington for establishing the new government and setting a host of key precedents. Lincoln for preventing the destruction of the country. And Roosevelt for successfully leading the United States through the worst domestic economic crisis and the worst international crisis in its history. Similarly, the two presidents who preceded Lincoln, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, are usually placed at the bottom in presidential ratings because of their policies and the fact that their incompetence resulted in the Civil War. So are Ulysses Grant and Warren G. Harding because of the massive corruption that occurred during their presidencies. Now, in most polls, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson are ranked just below Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. And then they are often followed by James K. Polk and James Monroe. Similarly, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Zachary Taylor, and Andrew Johnson are usually ranked at the bottom, either with or just a notch above Pierce, Buchanan, Grant, and Harding. The others who preceded Wilson fall somewhere in between in an average or adequate category. Now, Wilson's high ranking is a bit puzzling in light of his numerous failures and their negative consequences, as well as his numerous successes. But consequences do not constitute the only standard involved in rating presidents. In the case of both Wilson and the others, assessments are often based on the values that the assessors bring to their task. For Wilson, whether or not one approves of the progressive movement, and with it an activist presidency and an activist federal government, is critical in determining how one assesses his domestic record. If one is in favor of this, then the assessment will tend to be very positive. Similarly, whether or not one approves of an activist role for the United States in international affairs is critical in determining how one assesses Wilson's foreign policies. Again, if one favors a major role for the United States, the assessment of Wilson will be very high, both for entry into World War I and for his peacemaking efforts and the ensuing League of Nations. But in each case, the assessment will tend to be lower if one disagrees with the idea of an activist president and federal government or an activist role for the United States in the world. Now, such value judgments play a major role in all presidential ratings. Presidents usually listed as the worst, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Ulysses Grant, Warren G. Harding, for example, are put in that category for one of two reasons: incompetence or corruption. But these are not the only reasons one could conclude that someone was a terrible president. What about hypocrisy? What about out-and-out lying? Or what about breaking the law? And finally, what about sheer stupidity? Similarly, those usually placed in the highest category, Washington, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, are put in that category because of the enormous dangers the country faced during their tenures, dangers that they had to deal with. Establishing a new government amidst a world war for George Washington, fighting a civil war for Lincoln, and dealing with both the Great Depression and World War II for Franklin Roosevelt. Again, however, should this be the only category for a great presidency? What about political skill in office? What about lack of mistakes? By that standard, I often quip, my choice for the greatest president in U.S. history is William Henry Harrison, primarily because he died before he could do anything wrong. He only served in office 32 days. Furthermore, use of consequences as a standard requires treating with a grain of salt rankings of recent presidents. For we clearly do not yet know the full consequences of their actions. I received a telephone call from a journalist during the impeachment and trial of Bill Clinton, asking me how Clinton's impeachment would look 10 years from now. My reply, that depends on what happens in the next 10 years. By the way, one of my colleagues and friends gave the same reply, but added a quip of his own. Historians don't predict the future. Historians predict the past. Historians deal with the past, something that we have tried to emphasize in this course, and that the past is much more complex than it appears to be. Sometimes the consequences of presidential actions are positive and negative. That is definitely true for Wilson, but he is far from the only president with a mixed record of consequences. James K. Polk, a relatively unknown president, unexpectedly showed up in a 1948 poll in the near great category, primarily because in his one term in office, he said in advance he would only serve a single term, and he wanted to accomplish 4 major tasks, and he did. First, a downward revision of the tariff. Next, a sub-treasury plan to replace the Second National Bank. Third, a settlement of the Oregon controversy with Great Britain, whereby the United States obtained present-day Oregon and Washington in the Pacific Northwest. And finally, the waging of a successful and short war with Mexico, by which the United States secured Texas and obtained both California and the present southwestern states. But that war with Mexico guaranteed the enmity of Latin America against the Yankee Colossus to the north. And the acquisition of California and the Southwest led to a huge conflict over whether or not to allow slavery into these new territories. It thereby upset the sectional peace that had been maintained for so many years by the Missouri Compromise. And of course, that led to the Civil War. So should Polk be highly rated for massively expanding the size of this country, as well as his other accomplishments? Or should he be rated very low, perhaps even as low as Pierce and Buchanan, for the fact that this expansion played a major role in the coming of civil war? Similarly, how should one rate Richard Nixon? Given, for example, the positive consequences of his establishing relations with Communist China and his achievement of détente with the Soviet Union versus the very negative consequences of the criminal behavior that surrounded Watergate. One also needs to recognize that presidential polls and ratings are affected by changing American values and perspectives over time. Our changing views on race relations, for example, have deeply affected our views of the causes of the Civil War and of the Reconstruction era. No longer do we harshly condemn the radical Republicans and their program, as was done 75 years ago. Consequently, we no longer view Andrew Johnson, the president those Republicans impeached, as positively as we used to. Now, let me clarify, Johnson has never been in the top category. But in 1948, he was in the 19th position. Recently, he has moved all the way down to 41st place as one of the worst presidents in all of American history. There is also a complementary tendency to revise our negative assessments of Johnson's successor, Ulysses Grant, who has recently gone up in some recent polls. Andrew Jackson dropped from 6th place in 1948 to 14th place in a more recent poll, probably because of our changing views on just how democratic his presidency really was, as well as the negative impact of his destruction of the Second National Bank, an impact that included the Panic and the Depression of 1837. Jumping ahead, in the 20th century, Dwight Eisenhower's rating as president went up rather dramatically by 1982 from where it had been in 1961. Why? Well, there was release of additional documents, his diaries. But equally, if not more important, were the failures of his three more activist successors, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, as well as belated recognition of Eisenhower's unique, indirect style of leadership. Furthermore, there is often a sharp difference between the rating of a past president taken by historians and the rating by the general public. Harry Truman, for example, received a much higher rating from historians soon after his presidency ended than he did from the public in general. His successor, Eisenhower, at first received much higher ratings from the public than from the historians, and then the historians shifted. And in a 2011 Gallup poll, Americans agreed with the historians only on Lincoln as one of the top three, instead of Washington and Franklin Roosevelt as the other two. They put Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton in that elite group. Apparently, for the public, history consists only of an individual's lifetime. Furthermore, public views can change with the passage of time as much as historians' views change. In an interesting irony, the public's rating of Harry Truman went way up in the 1970s and the 1980s. At about the same time, it began to decline amongst many historians. A group of historians began to argue that Truman deserved partial blame for the Cold War and for the Second Great Red Scare, known as McCarthyism, even though McCarthyism would be directed against Truman. But, these critics argue, he had started it. Try to keep all of this in mind as in the next two lectures, we re-examine what I consider to be a few of our underrated and misunderstood presidents. Finally, let's come back to Woodrow Wilson. What about his ratings? They have gone down somewhat since the 1960s. I would argue primarily as a result of our changing views on race relations, women's rights, and civil liberties, perhaps of the UN as well. In 1948, he'd ranked number 4. In the 1990s, he ranked number 7. And he's a bit lower in the 21st century. But he's still way up there. Is he perhaps still overrated? His achievements are indeed impressive and consequential. But as we have seen, so are his failures by their negative consequences and by many of our contemporary standards. Yet his supporters ask, could any of his predecessors or contemporaries have done better given the new and enormous 20th century problems that he faced, both domestically and internationally? Now that, of course, is a what-if question, a counterfactual. And in a sense, it's unanswerable, since no one else was president from 1913 to 1921. But people love to ask. And I often wonder what would have happened if Theodore Roosevelt had won the 1912 election instead of Woodrow Wilson. Whereas Wilson's New Freedom sought to return to a mid-19th century world of competition, Roosevelt's New Nationalism realized that was impossible. And his was the first program to address 20th century realities in terms of business regulation rather than merely trust busting and social welfare legislation. And in foreign affairs, Theodore Roosevelt, at least in regard to his dealings with the great powers, was one of the most successful diplomats in all of U.S. history. He mediated an end to the Russo-Japanese War, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And he secretly mediated an end to the Moroccan crisis that could have easily led to the outbreak of World War I in 1905-1906. In fact, it almost did lead to the outbreak of war in those years. Now, given that record, one must ask if World War I would have even broken out if Roosevelt had won in 1912. Certainly, he would have actively tried to prevent it, much more actively than did Wilson, who was preoccupied at that date with the death of his first wife. Now, had Theodore Roosevelt failed to halt the outbreak of war, he probably would have joined the war much earlier than Wilson. And I seriously doubt his record in civil liberties would have been any better than Wilson's. Could very well have been worse. But I also doubt he would have ever attempted to replace the balance of power with collective security. Collective security was a concept that over and over again in the 20th and 21st centuries has proven to be unworkable. Given that fact, as well as the New Freedom's hearkening back to a past era of competition, was Wilson indeed ahead of his time, as his supporters often allege, or in reality, in many ways, behind his time? The standard popular view of the 1920s is that the country was tired of progressive reforms and overseas crusades. It elected in 1920 a president, Warren G. Harding, who verbalized its desire for a return to the pre-progressive era with his call for a return to normalcy. The result would be a supposed return to the business values of the late 19th century, as epitomized by President Calvin Coolidge's remark that, quote, the chief business of Americans is business. Coolidge's becoming president on Harding's unexpected death in 1923 also epitomized the supposed return to the social values of the 19th century. He was sworn in by his father, a notary public, by kerosene lamplight at the family home in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, where he was visiting. This was supposedly also a decade of a return to an isolationist foreign policy, as well as a focus on conformity, as epitomized in the popular novels of Sinclair Lewis. It was also a time period when Americans just wanted to have a good time, all of which would disgust the intellectuals and lead them to desert the United States for Paris as the, quote, lost generation. But in reality, the 1920s are far more complex than that, and more revolutionary. Indeed, in many ways, the 20s continued what had begun during the Progressive era and set the stage for contemporary America far more than they look back to any past era. Now, underlying all the changes of the 20s is the economic revolution that took place during the 1920s. That revolution was based on continued consolidation and the growing efficiency of business via scientific management. This had been explained by Frederick W. Taylor and indeed was known as Taylorism. And with this came the rise of a new class of business managers and an explosion in productivity as well as business consolidation. Per capita output went up 40%, production 46%. Giant national chains emerged in numerous fields, including food, A&P, clothes, Woolworths, and banking, Bank of America. By 1930, 200 corporations owned 50% of the nation's corporate wealth. Now, what I just described may seem on the surface like a continuation of the trends from the 1890s. But in reality, it is not. For this business growth and concentration was accompanied by a major shift in American industry during the 1920s, a shift from heavy industry to the production of new and cheap consumer items. This was largely made possible by the previously cited earlier work of Thomas Edison and others with electricity generation in cities, both for factories and for urban homes. By the 1920s, that had developed sufficiently to make possible the development, sale, and use of a host of new electrical devices in the home. The vacuum cleaner, the toaster, the clothes washer, the refrigerator. The mechanization of housework was taking place, in the words of one historian. Now, equally critical to the new economy was the automobile. The automobile was not a new invention in the 1920s. But by the 20s, Henry Ford had made it a consumer item available to the middle and lower classes by using assembly line techniques and scientific management to cut the price of an automobile by more than 2/3, from $950 to $290. That made it affordable to most, including Ford's own workers, whom he paid the then unheard of sum of $5 a day so that they can buy the cars that they made. In return, however, he issued a total ban on unions, would not tolerate them. Now, some consider what Ford did the start of what would be known eventually as welfare capitalism in industry, something that was put into effect to combat unionization. And you would have eventually the creation of pension funds, profit-sharing plans, etc. I would hardly call that a return to the conditions for workers of the late 19th century. Now, as a result of Ford's innovations, automobile production skyrocketed from 4,000 in 1900 to 4.8 million in 1929. Auto ownership jumped from 8 million to 23 million. Like electricity, the automobile would have a ripple effect on the entire economy, especially in such industries as steel, rubber, glass, oil, and electronics that are all involved in making cars. But there was also an indirect impact. Highway construction, concrete, roadside restaurants, gas stations, and the new motor hotels or motels. The automobile became the focal point of the entire economy, and it began to dramatically alter numerous aspects of American life, including, some have argued, sexual mores for youth. The backseat of the automobile, as one put it, became an American institution. Now, along with this economic revolution comes a phenomenal growth in advertising to convince people to buy all the cheap new consumer products that are now available, as well as the automobile. Now, again, advertising is not new, but there is a massive expansion of the industry, along with a major shift from trying to inform the public of a product's existence and what it supposedly can do. Truth in advertising is a flexible term at this time. But a shift from that to playing on psychological desires and needs, such as acceptance, prestige, sex, popularity. General Motors, for example, sought to compete with Ford by offering different brands of cars for different classes and different colors, as opposed to Ford's single brand and single color. When asked about colors, Ford's crack was that his customers could buy a Ford in any color, as long as it was black. This advertising mania becomes known as boosterism, and it was epitomized by Bruce Barton's best-selling 1925 book, The Man Nobody Knows. In it, Barton portrayed Jesus Christ as the greatest advertising executive and businessman in history. He thought of his life as business, Barton wrote. Every advertising man ought to study the parables of Jesus, schooling himself in their language and learning the elements of their power. Why? Because, Barton wrote, he picked up 12 men from the bottom ranks of business and forged them into an organization that conquered the world. The 20s also witnessed the rise of installment buying as a way the middle and lower classes could afford all these new items. The resulting economic boom would both feed and be fed by the continuing urbanization of the country. Indeed, it is in this decade that urban dwellers, and at this point, urban is defined as a city or town of 2,500 or more. It's in this decade that urban dwellers come to outnumber rural dwellers. That will mean new and expanded markets for goods and greater industrial concentration that is able to produce more, as well as a new and national urban culture that we still live with today. Now, helping to spread that new national urban culture will be the new mass media that emerged during this era, most notably radio and motion pictures. They will also create new national heroes. Radio will aid in the rise of spectator sports as a big business, both professional and collegiate. Especially noteworthy in the professional realm is baseball, which had a major scandal in 1919, the Black Sox scandal, but after the cleanup of that scandal, baseball became the national pastime, with such national heroes as Babe Ruth. That is no accident. Baseball is a game made for radio, as I discovered a few years ago. Consequently, I now listen more frequently to baseball games than I watch them. As for movies, aided by the advent of sound, the industry will explode in the 1920s. With 100 million people out of a total population of 120 million attending at least one movie each week. That's compared to 60 million who will go to church each week. The movies will also be shown overseas, and they will play a major role in the expansion of American culture overseas and the overseas image of the United States. Movies, as with sports, will create their own national heroes, movie stars. One, if I can pronounce his name correctly, Rodolfo Alfonso Raffaello Pier Filibert Guglielmi de Valentina de Anton Guola, better known, of course, as Rudolph Valentino, whose death at age 35 led to a mass hysteria at his funeral. But the ultimate hero of the 20s was Charles Lindbergh for his 33-hour solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, contrary to common belief, Lindbergh was not the first to fly across the Atlantic. It had been done in 1919 on a flight from Newfoundland to Ireland. Yet it is Lindbergh who became the hero, the ultimate symbol of the era, as man still the individual master of all these new machines. Also contrary to popular belief, the economic boom did not occur in all areas of the economy. Agriculture, for example, suffered enormously during this decade as wartime overseas demand ceased and European agriculture recovered from World War I. The economic boom that did occur would also be fed by government assistance and other moves to help business and thereby create prosperity for all. Once again, as emphasized in a previous lecture, there is no return to a 19th century laissez-faire attitude. The government will also help businesses to find new overseas markets during this time period, to keep the prosperity going and to expand it globally as a way to preserve international peace. That is anything but isolationist. So let's take a look now at government actions, both domestically and overseas during this era. The 1920s will witness a return to Republican dominance in national politics as the majority party. The Republicans had been the majority party really since William McKinley's election and the realignment of 1896. The only time they did not hold the White House and control the government was during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson, you will remember, won the first time with a minority of the vote because the Republican Party split. What you now get is a return to Republican majority rule, overseen by three presidents who are usually considered highly conservative. Presidents whose administrations supposedly harken back to the late 19th century. Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Each of these administrations also retains a stigma in historical memory. Harding's for corruption, Coolidge's for not heeding warning signs about the state of the economy, and Hoover's for failure to act in the ensuing economic collapse. But in reality, these reputations are not fully deserved, and they distort the records of all three presidents. All three administrations believed in using the World War I experiences in government-business cooperation to foster even greater cooperation. That cooperation was admittedly to be an alternative to regulation. But it is still a very, very active role for the government. The aims: greater growth, greater efficiency, greater prosperity, and international peace, on the grounds that a prosperous world will be a peaceful world, and a peaceful world enables you to have more prosperity. Positive government action in this regard will include not only lower taxes, but also the very high Fordney-McCumber tariff, and a Federal Highway Act and Bureau of Public Roads to provide federal aid for state roads, and a plan for a national highway system now that you have all of these automobiles. Government itself will become more efficient during this time via the creation of the Budget and Accounting Act that established a director of the budget. That enabled the executive branch of government to plan and produce for the first time a unified, coherent national budget. Progressivism is not dead either. To cite but a few of the many examples of progressivism in the 1920s, 34 states out of 48 will pass workmen's compensation laws during this time period. In the 1924 presidential election, a newly reformed progressive third party nominated Wisconsin progressive Robert La Follette for president. La Follette obtained 16% of the popular vote. Women will obtain the right to vote nationally, which had been a progressive reform movement. And they did so with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Also on a national level, immigration restriction that had been championed by the progressives achieved its most notable success with the passage in 1924 of the National Origins Act. That act totally excluded Asians and established very severe quotas on immigration that would henceforth be allowed from Eastern and Southern Europe. Approximately 2% of the number of such people in the United States in 1890, which was before the great wave from Eastern and Southern Europe really peaked. This law would essentially stay in effect until the 1960s. Now, one might argue that progressivism also continued via the related and continued, if not expanded, popularity of scientific racism, which in turn fed a continuation and expansion of the religious and racial intolerance that we had seen in the last years of the progressive era. This is the decade of Henry Ford's previously quoted anti-Semitic tracts. It is also the decade of the rise of a new Ku Klux Klan, which had somewhere between 3 and 5 million members, many of them now in the North as well as the South. This new expanded Klan did not limit itself to attacks on blacks. It now also attacked Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. 40,000 Klansmen will march in Washington in 1925. Now, the continued great migration of Southern blacks into northern cities would feed this emergence of the Klan as a northern as well as a southern phenomenon. This is also the decade of continued government assaults on the American left, as well as leftist immigrants, known from the progressive era as the first Great Red Scare. It had begun during World War I. It had continued immediately after the war with the notorious Palmer raids of 1919 to 1920, engineered by President Wilson's Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. During those raids, more than 4,000 people were illegally arrested and detained for their political beliefs. 249 alien radicals were deported. Now, this also continued throughout the 1920s and was symbolized for many by the arrest, conviction, and execution in 1927 in Massachusetts of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, 2 Italian immigrants and anarchists. They were charged with armed robbery and murder Their numerous supporters, both in the United States and around the world, argued that they had not committed the crimes and that their guilt had not been proven at their trial. Instead, these people argued, Sacco and Vanzetti had been found guilty and had been executed for what they were, immigrants and radicals. The 20s is also the decade of Prohibition, another progressive reform. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1919, and along with the Volstead Act, which defined anything as alcoholic that had 0.5% alcohol, it went into effect in the following year, with such well-known consequences as the rise of bootleg whiskey and organized crime. But contrary to popular belief, Prohibition did lead to a significant decrease in alcohol consumption, went down to 1/3 of the pre-World War I level and the lowest level in American history. It also led to the total demise of the saloon, which had been a key target of the temperance movement. And interestingly, organized crime became a way for many in the new immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe to rise out of poverty and for their families to enter the middle class and fulfill the American dream, as well as attain respectability and acceptance. Organized crime may have also been, in one sense, the only truly laissez-faire business at the time. The government did nothing to aid it, and some would argue the government did close to nothing to suppress it. One other aspect of progressivism in the 1920s needs to be mentioned here. Herbert Hoover, who was a key figure before his own presidency as Harding's and Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce, had been a famous Wilsonian progressive. And as we will see, in many ways he remained one. He was also one of the great heroes of this era, an engineer and an efficiency expert who in World War I had used his expertise for the humanitarian goal of feeding the starving populations of Belgium and other European countries. In the 1920s, Hoover will actively use his Commerce Department to help American corporations find new and expanded overseas markets. Along with the State Department, the Commerce Department will also promote overseas investment. One of the most notable such investments, and that's actually a lot more than an investment, was the Dawes Plan. In the Dawes Plan, the United States loaned private money to Germany and negotiated a linked reparations repayment schedule between Germany, France, and Britain. That ended a major European crisis over reparations payments. Now that, I would argue, is hardly isolationism, despite the continued American refusal to join the League of Nations. Similarly, the State Department under Secretaries of State Charles Evans Hughes and Frank B. Kellogg will be quite active in promoting and signing a series of treaties to help preserve the peace and prosperity of the era. You have naval arms limitation agreements, such as the 1921-22 Washington Treaties, which included the 4, 5, and 9 power pacts, limiting the size of the world's navies and maintaining both the status quo in the Pacific and the open door for China. You also have the 1930 London Naval Arms Limitation Treaty and the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact, outlawing war as an instrument of national policy. Again, all of this is hardly isolationism. The era will also witness major clashes between the newly emerging national urban culture and the traditional American rural culture. In its 1924 National Convention, for example, the Democratic Party will split so badly between its northern urban and southern rural wings over who to nominate and over such issues as prohibition and the Ku Klux Klan as to virtually commit political suicide. Condemnation of the Klan failed to pass by 1 vote, 543 to 542. The conflict over the presidential candidate pitted New York's wet governor, Al Smith, a Catholic who opposed prohibition, against the dry Protestant William McAdoo, who supported prohibition. It left the convention deadlocked for an incredible 102 ballots before a lackluster compromise candidate, New York Corporation lawyer John W. Davis, could be nominated on the 103rd ballot. Equally, if not more telling, is the famous Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee, where the state had outlawed the teaching of evolution. High school biology teacher John Scopes challenged the law and was arrested. He would be convicted at the trial. But that was really not the main attraction. This was the first trial ever broadcast over radio. And the center of attention was the duel that emerged between William Jennings Bryan, who stood forth as an expert Bible witness for the prosecution, and the prominent lawyer for the defense, Clarence Darrow. It was a duel in which Darrow humiliated Bryan and his cause by mocking Bryan's literal interpretation of creation, pointing out that if Joshua had indeed made the sun stand still, the earth would have turned into a molten mess. He also forced Bryan to modify his literal interpretation by admitting that creation might have lasted millions of years rather than 6 days. But at least as telling as all of that was a rural-urban exchange that took place during Darrow's interrogation of Bryan, when the courtroom audience applauded Bryan after he had made a statement. Darrow acidly commented, "Great applause from the bleachers." "From those you call the yokels," Bryan mockingly shot back. "That is the ignorance of Tennessee, the bigotry. Those are the people who you insult." "You insult," Darrow responded, "every man of science and learning in the world because he does not believe in your fool religion." The jury found Scopes guilty in less than 10 minutes, but his cause had won. Bryan was humiliated, and he died very soon after the trial. Now, historians recognize the 1920s are much more complex and multifaceted than the traditional popular image of the era. It was conservative in many ways. The elimination of numerous taxes on the wealthy, the slashing of the federal budget. But in many ways, we see in the 1920s both a continuation of portions of the progressive era and the birth of the modern American economy and urban culture. We also see a very active foreign policy, despite the refusal to join the League of Nations, an active foreign policy befitting a nation with the largest economy in the world. We also see the continued development of a government-business partnership, both domestically and in foreign affairs, designed to achieve the twin goals of peace and prosperity. And in most areas, the result is an incredibly peaceful and prosperous United States and world. Indeed, this is probably the most peaceful and prosperous decade of the 20th century, and the one in which the United States was more secure than in any other decade of the 20th century, despite the very low budgets and size for the armed forces. But all of this depended upon the continued health and growth of the American economy, a health and growth that collapsed in late 1929. And that collapse would transform the United States and the world. Herbert Hoover is generally considered an abject failure as president for his refusal to deal aggressively with the Great Depression. In the process, he is often classed with his two Republican predecessors as a conservative who did not believe that government should play a major role in the economy, or in anything else for that matter. As Franklin D. Roosevelt famously asserted in the 1936 presidential campaign, for 12 years the nation had been afflicted with, quote, "hear nothing, see nothing, do nothing government." The nation looked to government, but government looked away. The Republican philosophy, Roosevelt sarcastically continued, was that government was best, which was, quote, most indifferent. Yet, Hoover had previously been known as a major and highly successful progressive figure, the forgotten progressive, in the words of one of his biographers. Furthermore, he did more than any previous president to combat serious economic depression. And in doing so, he began many programs that would later be associated with Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Roosevelt, the man who defeated him in the 1932 election and whose programs Hoover would sharply attack. This lecture will take another look at Hoover and try to explain the reasons for this discrepancy between his record and his reputation. Well, who was Herbert Hoover? He was a mining engineer who developed an extraordinary reputation as an effective and efficient administrator and humanitarian. During World War I, he organized Belgian food relief. He then served as head of the U.S. Food Administration once the United States entered the war. After the war, he accompanied Woodrow Wilson to Paris and organized major food relief programs for the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe. Throughout this time, he was considered a progressive with great political possibilities. Both parties courted him. He chose to be a Republican. He had been a Theodore Roosevelt Bull Moose supporter in 1912 before he joined the Wilson administration. And he was, as previously noted, a major figure in the administrations of Harding and Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce. Now, again, as noted in the last lecture, the 20s were in some ways a continuation rather than a rejection of progressivism. Hoover, as Commerce Secretary, became one of the great symbols of this. In many ways, the perfect symbol of the organizational revolution of the 1920s. He was the personification of the new managers, specialists, and social engineers who worshiped efficiency and business government cooperation, the men who were reorganizing American society. He also was optimistically predicting continued and never-ending prosperity. Indeed, in the 1928 election, Hoover famously stated that, quote, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We have not yet reached the goal, but given the chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall very soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." Hoover easily defeated his Democratic opponent Al Smith of New York in the 1928 election, but his prediction about ending poverty, of course, proved to be anything but accurate, as the stock market, the American economy, and the global economy all collapsed during his presidency. Now, the causes of this financial and economic collapse are numerous, complex, and still being debated. But in summary, the major factors were as follows. First, as numerous historians have noted, a mass production society requires mass consumption. And while the United States had become a consumer society, its consumption was not adequate. This was true in both agriculture and industry, and it had been for many years. Again, as noted in the last lecture, agriculture was depressed throughout the 1920s. So were the coal and textile industries. And increased industrial mechanization had already led to serious unemployment. Now, whether you define the issue as overproduction or underconsumption, the result was a very serious economic problem. Now, one major reason was maldistribution of wealth. The great prosperity of the 1920s was not shared by all. Indeed, anywhere from 40 to 60% of the population lived below the marginal subsistence level, then $2,000 a year. That translated into very limited purchasing power. Compounding this problem was an unsound corporate structure in which 200 out of 400,000 corporations owned 43% of the national wealth. That led to price rigidity despite lack of consumer purchasing power and a pyramid structure that could collapse entirely via a chain reaction. The banking structure was equally unsound. It had been since the days of Andrew Jackson, with thousands of local, unsound, and unregulated banks. What about the Federal Reserve System? Well, it was still in its infancy. It had only been established in 1914. It was still underutilized, and it had little or no control at this time over many banks. It did nothing to prevent an eventual collapse. In fact, as we will see, its 1927 policies played a role in that collapse. And when it did finally act, the Fed pursued policies that, in retrospect, were the reverse of the policies it should have pursued. It thus made the problems worse. All of this was aggravated by unprecedented speculation in the stock market because of the lack of investment opportunities and because of the belief that the market would always go up. The international economic and financial structure was equally unstable due to World War I and its aftermath. Both the United States and other industrialized nations had responded in the 1920s with higher tariffs. But higher tariffs in turn led to a decline in international trade. That led to more economic strains, the withdrawal of foreign funds from the United States, and eventually the withdrawal of U.S. funds from overseas. Installment buying and the creation of artificial demand via advertising only masked these problems. And in doing so, and thereby postponing the day of reckoning, installment buying and advertising made the situation worse. While the economy was thus already in serious trouble by 1928, the stock market continued to boom. Obvious question, why? Well, with consumer demand saturated, corporate profits from the 1920s went into stock speculation rather than more plant and machinery. Since there was less corporate demand for loans for expansion, banks loaned more money for stock purchases. Now, much of this went not into direct stock purchases, but into call loans that stockbrokers made to customers at a high interest rate so as to enable people to buy stock on margin, to put down only a percentage of the money that was needed to purchase the stock. If you stop and think about it, it's actually a form of installment buying as applied to the stock market. Corporations did this too, and you only needed anywhere from 10 to 50% down in this system. Now, people with money, but already saturated with consumer goods, and people without money who wanted to get in on the action can do so via this easy credit system. And the stock can then, that you purchase on margin, can then be used as collateral for more loans for more margin purchases on the market. For example, you could start off with $100, buy stock that cost $1,000. As that stock went up, sell it and use the proceeds to just keep on building this way. The Federal Reserve made matters worse by lowering the rediscount rate at which banks could borrow in 1927. With easy credit, the banks borrowed from the Fed at the 3.5% interest rate, but then relent the money they had borrowed to the call market for a 10% interest rate or higher. This entire boom had utterly no economic foundation on which to rest. It was a speculative mania, a bubble fueled by the belief that the market would go up forever. Previous shocks were dismissed since they had been temporary. As the historian David Kennedy has noted, quote, mere money was not at the root of the evil soon to befall Wall Street. Men were. Men and women whose lust for the fast buck had loosed all restraints of financial prudence or even common sense. Full panic hit during the last week of October. First Black Thursday and then the incredible October 29th. Stocks would lose 1/3 of their value in 3 months. Indeed, between September 3rd and November 13th, 1929, GE stock fell from approximately 396 to 168, General Motors from 72 3/4 to 36, Montgomery Ward from nearly 138 to less than 50, Union Carbide from nearly 139 to 59, and U.S. Steel from nearly 262 to 150. Westinghouse fell from nearly 289 to less than 103, and Woolworth from about 100 to less than 53. Now, this did not cause the Depression. In effect, the Depression had previously begun, but it did make things substantially worse. How? The incredible loss of money wiped out purchasing power. The loss of stock money also led to bank failures. And a bank failure wipes out the savings of the people who had put their money into the bank and thus hurts purchasing power even more. There was at this point no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If your bank went under, that was the end of your money. Now, all of this forced industry to cut back on production, which meant layoffs and lower wages and thus even less purchasing power for the nation as a whole. In addition, because of the bank failures, no loans were available, and loans are the needed lubrication for the entire economy to work. The banking system as a whole then began to collapse in late 1930. 600 more banks failed in November and December of that year. The total was 1,352 failed banks by the end of the year. Now, if you had money in a bank that had not failed, the immediate panic reaction is pull your money out. And what occurred were runs on the other banks. Now, banks do not keep all their money on hand. They had to call in their loans and sell their assets in order to meet these runs. That, in turn, drove down the value of other assets and further contracted the money supply and tightened credit. The result, a vicious cycle that fed into other pre-existing problems. As if all of that was not enough, in 1931, the European financial structure began to collapse. This was due to a drying up of American loans, which led to a drying up of German reparations to the World War I allies that had been linked to those loans by the Dawes Plan. In addition, the French pressured to stop a German customs union with Austria, and that set off a panic in Vienna that then spread to Germany. Europeans, and the Americans as well, responded with high tariffs and capital export controls to prevent a gold drain. But that froze a large percentage of the world's financial assets and crippled international trade, which went down from $36 billion to $12 billion during the years 1929 to 1932. And that, in turn, led to a new run on U.S. banks and more failures. In 1931, 2,294 failures. That was a record. The Federal Reserve at first did nothing to save the banks. And when it eventually acted, it raised the rediscount rate to stop the outflow of gold, which in retrospect was exactly the opposite of what it should have done once again. It had at first provided easy money when it should have been tight, 1927 to 29. Then it did nothing to save the banks when it should have done something. And then it pursued a tight monetary policy in 1932 when it should have lowered the rediscount rate. You have the perfect storm. Well, what is Hoover's response going to be to this? Financial collapses and economic depressions are nothing new in U.S. history. Previous ones had occurred in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, to name but a few. These depressions had been viewed as a normal part of the business cycle and part of the market's self-correcting mechanism via Adam Smith's invisible hand. The traditional response of government had been to do nothing and let the market correct itself. Contrary to popular opinion, Hoover did not accept this logic, and he refused to do so for a host of reasons. First, he is one of the world's most famous humanitarians. He would not let Europeans starve during World War I, and he is not about to let Americans starve under his presidency. He is also a famous progressive who does not believe government is powerless and should do nothing. People no longer believe that government can or should do nothing either. And they no longer believe that a depression like this is normal. But what about all that talk that Hoover made in 1928 about wiping out poverty? Many Americans ask. Surely he can and should do something. In addition, or connected with this, doing nothing could mean revolution. And indeed, it did mean revolution in many countries, especially Germany, where the Nazis became the largest party because of the Depression. Now, Hoover did come up with a program. It was a program that reflected his values, most notably his belief in the so-called associational society, voluntary groups for rational scientific planning. Government's role, stimulate and encourage such groups, but don't dictate to them. Hoover thus holds a series of conferences with business and labor leaders to reach voluntary agreements to keep production up and wages up. For agriculture, he uses the just-passed Agricultural Marketing Act of 1929, setting up the Federal Farm Board to promote agricultural cooperatives and stabilization corporations that would agree to limit production. There was also some limited ability here to buy surplus. Hoover also agreed to a modest public works program to provide jobs. And he supported the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the highest tariff in all of American history, to eliminate external competition for agriculture, to encourage business, and to restore confidence. Hoover will also encourage state and local public works projects via his 1932 Emergency Relief and Construction Act, which will provide $2 billion for public works and relief loans to the states. Nor is that the end of it. Hoover also supports voluntary programs to provide loans to endangered financial institutions, with sound banks to provide funds to the banks in trouble. But these programs do not end the Depression. The Depression only gets worse. And with their failure, Hoover in 1932 goes even further in an effort to save a financial structure about to collapse entirely. To deal with frozen assets, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 1932, not to be confused with the Glass-Steagall Banking Act under Roosevelt of 1933. The 1932 Act allowed commercial paper to be accepted as collateral for Federal Reserve loans and notes. That also allowed for the release of gold and the expansion of the money supply. With the same goal, the Federal Home Loan Bank Act allowed home mortgage paper to be accepted as security for loans at new home loan banks. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, modeled on the World War I War Finance Corporation to fund the construction of military plants, provided government funds for emergency loans to banks and large businesses. Congress provided the corporation with $500 million to start with and the authorization to borrow anywhere from $1 to $5 billion more. Now, this did mark a shift from Hoover's previous insistence on voluntarism to direct government action. Direct government action will be a key component of Franklin Roosevelt's later New Deal measures as well. New Dealer Rexford Tugwell later stated in this regard that most of the New Deal policies were, as he said, extrapolated from programs that Hoover started. Now, all of this is unprecedented. Obvious question, why then does Herbert Hoover get such a bad do-nothing reputation? Well, there are numerous reasons. Partially, it is the result of Democratic campaign propaganda in the 1930s. It is also the result of the fact that later New Deal measures went much further than Hoover and made his efforts appear nearly non-existent in comparison. In this regard, future events will distort our understanding of what Hoover actually did during his presidency. And his own later strident attacks on the New Deal only exacerbated such perceptions. But equally, if not more important, is Hoover's own behavior from 1929 to 1932. First, his public relations turned very bad as a result of his methods. Now, in good times, Hoover had come across as a deeply respected efficiency expert. But now in bad times, he comes across simply as very, very cold. I think it important to realize in this regard that despite being elected president in 1928, Herbert Hoover was not a professional politician. He was an engineer and an administrator. He had held no elected office since college. All of his positions had been appointed, not elected. As an engineer and an efficiency expert, he likes to cite statistics. That's fine during prosperity, not during depression. Hoover also consistently utters optimistic statements that are simply at odds with reality. Why does he do so? He believes the system is basically sound and that he needs to restore confidence and maintain faith. But as a result, he seems like a fool lost in his own world. It's important to realize that Hoover is far from alone in a belief that the system is sound. It's a belief shared by numerous businessmen. Henry Ford will comment that the crash is just, quote, a speculator's panic, and that the key remains production and business leadership. He'll also tell workers not to depend on employers, but find their own work and cultivate a plot of land. Wonderful advice given the situation. It's also important to realize that Hoover is an ideologue who insists on working within clearly prescribed limits and who has a tremendous fear of what will happen if the government ever begins to dictate policy. He thus sticks at first with a voluntary cooperative approach. And it fails because the system is not sound and the agreements made cannot be kept. Furthermore, some of his actions to restore confidence, such as the Smoot-Hawley tariff, only make recovery more difficult by shutting down international trade and finance. In addition, and linked to this fear of the consequences of having the government dictate policy, Hoover adamantly refuses to supply federal relief. He labels it a dole that will destroy individual initiative and the American system. He thus vetoes the Garner-Wagner relief bill and insists that states must provide relief to prevent federal tyranny. But the states have no funds to do so. Well, Hoover says we can loan you the funds to do so. But that really is not going to do it. And in this refusal to provide federal relief, the great humanitarian comes to be perceived as either inhuman or blind to reality, or perhaps both. And when Hoover's cooperative associational approach fails, he falls back on the World War I model and trickle-down theory, whereby he is willing to loan federal money to banks and big businesses through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and other units. Combined with his veto of federal relief, he looks like he's willing to save the banks, but not the people from starving. In the words of historian David Kennedy, the great humanitarian, the great engineer, now appears to be the great Scrooge. To make matters worse, Hoover adamantly refuses to go any further than he has to provide federal aid to business. He rejects the so-called SWOPE plan for an operation similar to what would become the New Deal's National Recovery Administration because of his fear of government control. He also says no to corporate requests for cartel agreements. Indeed, he even begins to pursue antitrust prosecutions, which alienates business as well as everyone else. Hoover also follows his innovative 1932 acts with a counterproductive effort to rebalance the budget via tax increases, as well as insistence on remaining on the gold standard and on international currency stabilization. And if anything, he becomes more ideologically and personally rigid as a result of being forced into the drastic measures of 1931-1932. That rigidity can be seen in his continued support of prohibition, a key experiment to him in moral values overcoming crass materialism, as well as being a progressive measure and a way to counter the economic costs of drink, but one that has clearly failed by this time. Yet Hoover refuses to admit this. Even more illustrative of his growing rigidity is his reaction to the so-called bonus army. World War I veterans from the American Expeditionary Force, known as the AEF, who organize as the Bonus Expeditionary Force, the BEF, they march on Washington and they camp on Capitol Hill to demand early payment of the bonus granted them in the 1920s. When the Senate refused to agree, most of them accepted the offer of a free railroad ticket home, but 2,000 remained camped at Anacostia Flats. When conflict with the police in condemned buildings then occurred, Hoover, on the recommendation of Secretary of War Patrick Hurley, called out the Army on July 28th. Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, with his then aides Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, then exceeded his orders and attacked the veterans and their families with tanks, tear gas, machine guns, and 1,000 troops. As an eyewitness put it, soldiers attacking former soldiers was, quote, like sons attacking fathers. Hoover and Hurley then defended these actions by asserting that the bonus marchers were subversives, an absurd charge and a clear sign of Hoover's frustration and his losing touch with reality. Well, what can we conclude from all of this? First, our understanding of Hoover and his policies has been seriously distorted by a series of factors. These include not only the failure of his programs, but also the propaganda of his political opponents, later government measures that made his efforts appear nearly non-existent, and his own later attacks on those measures. In this regard, future events distorted our perceptions of what Hoover actually did from 1929 to 1933 and who he was. But equally important was Hoover's own behavior, most notably his ideological rigidity, which made him appear cold, heartless, and willing to save the banks and big business, but not the people. Ironically, his past image as a great humanitarian was thus not only shattered, but actually reversed. Furthermore, the shift in the economy from prosperity to depression, combined with his training and mentality as an engineer and reputation as an efficiency expert, turned his previously very effective public relations into the exact opposite. And without extensive political experience, this highly intelligent super administrator was not able to adjust and reverse the process. In this regard, all of Hoover's intelligence, training, and experiences were, if anything, counterproductive. He is not alone in having had such an experience as president. Indeed, it's interesting to note in this regard that two of the brightest men elected president in the 20th century had been engineers, and both failed as president and were not re-elected: Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter. Intelligence and ability in areas of engineering and administration, it appears, may not translate into success in the political realm. During the 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt was simultaneously one of the most beloved and one of the most hated presidents in U.S. history. In 1936, Roosevelt received the largest majority vote in the history of presidential politics. And to many, he was one of the greatest presidents in all of American history for his New Deal program to combat the Great Depression, as well as his leadership in World War II. To Roosevelt's numerous critics, however, he was a dangerous hypocrite with dictatorial tendencies whose New Deal program threatened the survival of economic and political liberty in the country. Now, with the advantage of all these years of hindsight, 7 decades, it is now safe to say that Roosevelt and the New Deal did not destroy economic or political liberty in the United States. But it is equally true that the New Deal failed to end the Great Depression, and that it spawned many of the political and economic problems that we live with today. Yet both of those statements that I just made are only partially true, and each of them, if not qualified, provides a very distorted view of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. In this lecture, we will look at what the New Deal attempted to do and what it actually did. And once again, we will see a host of unintended, as well as some intended, consequences. Now, to do so, we will first look at the crisis Roosevelt faced and briefly go through the major New Deal actions in that crisis. We will then assess Roosevelt's successes and failures, the reasons for those successes and failures, and the long-term consequences of the New Deal. So let us begin with Roosevelt's basic goals and the facts. Roosevelt was elected and then inaugurated amidst the greatest economic crisis in U.S. history. On Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1933, the Great Depression had brought the economic and financial life of the country to a virtual standstill. A full 25% of the workforce was unemployed. The New York Times stock index, which had been as high as 452 and then had fallen to 224 by the end of 1929, was now down to 58, with the consumer price index having fallen from 53 to 38. U.S. Steel, which had gone from 250,000 employees to 18,000 employees, now had no full-time employees. The gross national product was now down to half its 1929 figure. 1/3 of all U.S. banks had already failed, and in February 1933, the remainder began to fail. By Inauguration Day, 38 state governors had closed the banks so as to prevent a total financial collapse. Symbolically, the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago Board of Trade both closed on what was a dark, gloomy Inauguration Day in Washington. Now, Roosevelt's first and most important goal was to end this financial crisis, and primarily by psychological means that would restore people's confidence and prevent further runs on the banks. In this, he was very successful, and quite quickly. The process began with his famous inaugural address, in which he insisted that there was nothing to fear but fear itself. The address as a whole stunned a numbed nation and gave it what one biographer labeled, quote, a huge shot of adrenaline.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
But saying there was nothing to fear was utter nonsense. There was plenty to fear. Yet what mattered on March 4th was not the content, but the tone. And the address hit a public nerve. The White House was flooded with mail of unprecedented volume and intensity. 450,000 letters arrived in the first week alone. Now, that pace would not continue, but letters to Roosevelt would average 4,000 to 7,000 a week, and that would require an expansion of the White House mailroom staff from 1 to 70. On the day after the inauguration, Sunday, March 5th, Roosevelt used a World War I era law to shut all banks in the country still open in order to prevent even more runs and a total financial collapse on Monday. But he ingeniously labeled it a, quote, bank holiday, and stopped all gold transactions, called Congress into special session, which was to begin on March 9th, and then disappeared with his staff to draft legislation that would be presented to Congress. On March 8th, he held his first press conference. When Congress convened the next day, it was presented with an emergency banking bill, largely written by and for bankers. It would provide for government inspection and assistance to reopen sound banks. It passed the House of Representatives unread in 38 minutes. It received Senate approval and presidential signature within 8 hours. Roosevelt then presented and Congress quickly passed a bill to cut federal spending in an effort to balance the budget by cutting veterans' benefits and federal salaries. There was also a bill to allow the sale of and taxing of beer and wine, now that the Prohibition Amendment had been repealed. On March 12th, FDR gave the first of his famous fireside chats over the radio. 60 million Americans heard him say the banking system was sound and that the banks would reopen on the following day.
The bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation.
On that day, March 13th, the banks opened to lines of people not lined up to withdraw their funds, but to deposit more funds. The immediate financial and psychological crises were over. But beyond ending the immediate crisis, Roosevelt and his advisors sought through their policies to achieve three fundamental goals, the so-called 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Temporary relief for those suffering the most from the Depression until full recovery occurred, economic recovery in both agriculture and industry, and reform of the economic and financial system so that a collapse like this could never occur again. To do this, Roosevelt would propose over the next few weeks 15 major bills, all of which Congress passed in the ensuing 6 weeks as part of the famous 100 days. These included, just to name a few of the most important and well-known, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Homeowners Loan Act, and bills establishing the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. Then in 1935-36, Roosevelt and Congress went much further. The most famous of these so-called Second New Deal bills included a massive public works program that put millions of unemployed to work, and with this, the establishment of the Works Progress Administration under Harry Hopkins that would wind up employing a total of 8 million, about 1/3 of the jobless, for a total cost of about $11 billion. You also had the Social Security Act, providing national old age insurance, as well as care of the destitute and dependent, and the beginnings of unemployment insurance. You had the Wagner Labor Relations Act that established the National Labor Relations Board, and for the first time, threw the weight of government behind the right of labor to collective bargaining. You had higher taxes on the wealthy, rural electrification, and more federal control over the banking system and public utilities. Now, these bills from both the first and second New Deals were partially, but only partially successful in achieving the goals of relief, recovery, and reform. In the first New Deal, the downward spiral was halted and recovery started. Confidence was restored, starvation avoided, hope sustained, suffering cushioned. There was also a modest recovery by 1934. But then recovery stalled, and it stalled far short of the economic figures of 1929. Now, as a result of the second New Deal measures, additional and major recovery did take place. Indeed, the economy was nearing its 1929 levels by the end of Roosevelt's first term. But most of the gains were then wiped out by a major recession in 1937-1938. The New Deal's relief bills did succeed in helping many of those suffering the most, but the bills were too modest to help all. And New Deal recovery policies simultaneously made the economic situation worse for many of these people. I'll talk a bit more about that later. Now, while the moves to reform the system did prevent another collapse, that is, until those moves were partially dismantled in the 1980s and 1990s, they did not prevent the major recession of 1937-1938. To understand fully why the New Deal was only partially successful, we must first take a closer look at Roosevelt himself and his advisors to see how they operated and what they believed. Franklin Roosevelt may well have been the greatest politician this country has ever produced. But for that very reason, he is extremely difficult to figure out. One can never take his public or even his private statements at face value. He was an evasive charmer, a master manipulator of people with a front of jovial simple-mindedness, masking a very complex and secretive interior. He reserved his innermost thoughts to himself. Furthermore, ideas and consistency were not very important to him. He was not a deep thinker. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said he had a second-class intellect, but a first-class temperament. He also had a very short attention span, but a mind like flypaper, as one historian put it. Another has compared his mind to, quote, a spacious, cluttered warehouse, a teeming curiosity shop continuously restocked with randomly acquired intellectual oddments. Roosevelt was willing to experiment and see what worked, but his experimentation had severe limits. He did not exist in an intellectual vacuum, and he was part of his era and his class. Consequently, he had no socialist or Marxian ideas. Nationalization of the banks in 1933, for example, was never considered an option. And he was actually a very conservative individual who wanted to preserve the essentials of the American system and believed the only way to do so was to change that system. Roosevelt's expertise was not with ideas, but in getting ideas accepted by Congress and the American people. In this, he was a political genius and a media genius. But for that very reason, as well as the others just cited, Roosevelt's program often made more political sense than it made economic sense. To make matters worse, his advisors, known as the Brain Trust, disagreed sharply in what they recommended to him. All of them had roots in the progressive era and believed the government had a responsibility to ensure some sort of security for all. But there was no unity beyond that regarding what specific policies needed to be enacted. One group, the old Theodore Roosevelt nationalists, accepted large corporations and the end of the free and open market. They wanted to establish some form of business-government cooperation that would both curb big business and restore it, as well as agriculture. But within that group, there was no agreement as to what or how to do this. You also had the old Woodrow Wilson New Freedomites, who wanted to discipline the financiers and break up big business to restore competition. Others had ideas that came from the populists, such as a fear and hatred of Wall Street and a focus on helping and regulating agriculture. And urban social reformers, influenced by the old social gospel movement, favored aid to the aged and poor. Others with World War I experience would focus on central direction of the economy. Now, contrary to popular mythology, most of these reformers also wanted a balanced budget, and they did not believe in massive deficit spending to create purchasing power, something that was at that time being recommended by the British economist John Maynard Keynes. Further complicating the situation was Roosevelt's style of government, what we would today call the theory of competitive administration. Roosevelt staffed offices with people having opposing ideas, often within the same department. Now, that can lead to great creativity when there's agreement on fundamentals. But as we've just seen, there was not agreement on fundamentals, and Roosevelt did not provide it. The result was often chaos and immobility. The result of all of this would be a hodgepodge of legislation stemming from the ideas of all the different groups. All were concerned with the 3 R's of relief, recovery, and reform, but with different emphases at different times. As the New Dealer Raymond Moley said, thinking there was a master plan was equal to believing that, quote, the accumulation of stuffed snakes, baseball pictures, school flags, old tennis shoes, carpenter's tools, geometry books, and chemistry sets in a boy's bedroom could have been put there by an interior decorator. Now, Roosevelt at first focused on restoring confidence and recovery. And while the emphasis was on recovery, there was something for everyone in the first 15 bills of the first 100 days. In the National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, there was one section for collective bargaining for labor, another section establishing work relief, even though the primary purpose of the bill was the recovery of business. But in general, and again contrary to mythology, The emphasis in the first New Deal was very pro-big business, as per the New Nationalists and those with World War I ideas. Government planning in conjunction with business. This is best seen in the National Recovery Administration, which actually encouraged price fixing and the formation of cartels. But the ensuing recovery was very limited. Why? Two major reasons were the competing nature of the spending programs. And along with that, continued fiscal conservatism by the president, his advisors, and Congress. The goal remained a balanced budget, as seen in the New Deal's early legislation to cut federal spending and increase revenues via a tax on beer and wine. And contrary to the myths, there was no great increase in government and deficit spending at this time. Furthermore, the relief measures were too limited to generate full employment and thus full recovery. And they were often at cross purposes with the recovery measures. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, for example, focused on the destruction of crops to raise prices, but that had a very negative effect on tenant farmers. Now, the failures in the first New Deal made Roosevelt more willing to experiment with more drastic measures in 1935-36. So did the fact that despite the conservative and pro-business orientation of the first New Deal, businessmen turned against Roosevelt as the immediate crisis receded. And by 1934, there were cries that the New Deal was going communist. Obvious question, why? Businessmen were appalled by the relief measures and the administrative chaos of the New Deal. And perhaps more importantly, they were appalled by what they perceived as a threat to their managerial power and a loss of status to the government that was implicit in such measures as the National Recovery Administration. At the same time, Roosevelt came under attack from the left and from a series of demagogues such as Huey Long of Louisiana, who threatened to challenge his re-election and claimed that he was not doing enough. Roosevelt also faced a growing militancy from farmers, newly unionized industrial workers in the CIO, who had more than tripled in numbers, and congressional Democrats, who had increased their numbers in the 19th as a threat to their managerial power and a loss of status to the government that was implicit in such measures as the National Recovery Administration. At the same time, Roosevelt came under attack from the left and from a series of demagogues such as Huey Long of Louisiana, who threatened to challenge his re-election and claimed that he was not doing enough. Roosevelt also faced a growing militancy from farmers, newly unionized industrial workers in the CIO, who had more than tripled in numbers, and congressional Democrats, who had increased their numbers in the 1934 election and were pressing for much more than Roosevelt was willing to offer. As if all of that was not enough, the Supreme Court in 1935 declared the 1934 election and were pressing for much more than Roosevelt was willing to offer. As if all of that was not enough, the Supreme Court in 1935 declared both the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which were the centerpieces of the first New Deal's recovery legislation, to be unconstitutional. Under the impact of these attacks and threats, Roosevelt swung to the left in 1935 and 1936 and sided with both the anti-big business New Freedomites and the big spenders in the Brain Trust. These second New Deal measures, particularly the heavy deficit spending, $4 billion in 1936, and the subsequent employment of millions of workers in both the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which were the centerpieces of the first New Deal's recovery legislation, to be unconstitutional. Under the impact of these attacks and threats, Roosevelt swung to the left in 1935 and 1936 and sided with both the anti-big business New Freedomites and the big spenders in the Brain Trust. These second New Deal measures, particularly the heavy deficit spending, $4 billion in 1936, and the subsequent employment of millions of workers in work relief projects, raised the economy nearly back to its 1929 levels, and lowered unemployment to 14%. But as with the first New Deal, these measures were much less radical than they appeared, and they negatively affected many Americans. For example, under Southern pressure, Roosevelt agreed that Social Security would not apply to farm laborers, domestic servants, or those working in establishments with fewer than 10 employees. That left out 9.4 million workers, disproportionately black. Furthermore, the new tax bills did not redistribute wealth, and parts of them were a sham and for show. And for every dollar spent on unemployment relief and public works, another dollar was spent subsidizing banks and businesses. Roosevelt also made clear that he was not in favor of long-term relief. He labeled it a narcotic that, quote, induces a spiritual and moral disintegration, fundamentally destructive relief projects, raised the economy nearly back to its 1929 levels, and lowered unemployment to 14%. But as with the first New Deal, these measures were much less radical than they appeared, and they negatively affected many Americans. For example, under Southern pressure, Roosevelt agreed that Social Security would not apply to farm laborers, domestic servants, or those working in establishments with fewer than 10 employees. That left out 9.4 million workers, disproportionately black. Furthermore, the new tax bills did not redistribute wealth, and parts of them were a sham and for show. And for every dollar spent on unemployment relief and public works, another dollar was spent subsidizing banks and businesses. Roosevelt also made clear that he was not in favor of long-term relief of the national fiber, and never did he call for an egalitarian society. One of his foremost biographers, James McGregor Burns, has consequently labeled him more a British-style classic conservative than a progressive or a liberal. And this is an aristocratic conservatism that focuses on social responsibility, a respect for the limits of human knowledge, and a respect for traditional forms of religious worship, a recognition of the importance of personal property, and perhaps most importantly, an understanding that stability is not the equivalent of immobility. Furthermore, and again contrary to mythology, Roosevelt never accepted Keynesian concepts of deficit spending. He saw any deficit spending as a very temporary expedient, and he remained firmly committed to the balanced budget. Consequently, after his re-election in 1936, he concluded incorrectly that the Depression was over and it was time to rebalance the budget by cutting government spending, particularly deep cuts in the Works Progress Administration and the Public Works Administration's work relief programs. At the same time, the new Social Security tax actually removed another $2 billion of potential spending money. Benefits would not begin until 1940. And the Federal Reserve, fearing inflation, contracted the money supply by increasing reserve requirements for member banks. The result of all of this, a major recession in 1937-38 that wiped out many of the gains of the first term. Industrial production dropped 33%, wages 35%, national income 13%, unemployment increased by 4 million. At the same time, Roosevelt's ill-considered attempt to pack the Supreme Court broke his political hold over Congress and led to cries of dictatorship. In effect, it ended the New Deal after one final burst of legislation in 1938. But full recovery was not reached until 1941, and then largely under the impact of World War II. So what then did the New Deal actually do, and what did it not do? It clearly did not end the Great Depression. World War II did. Nor did it establish socialism or ever even desire to do so. Nor did it accept and institute massive deficit spending. That happened only during World War II. There was no major redistribution of wealth, no change in the basics of the American capitalist system. Indeed, in retrospect, it was quite conservative in what it attempted to do. But that is only part of the story. It did not appear conservative at the time, and it had an enormous impact on almost all aspects of American life. The consequences were both positive and negative. And while some were planned, many were totally unplanned, as the historical law of unintended consequences asserted itself once again. First of all, while the New Deal did not end the Great Depression, it did stop the downward spiral and did achieve a great deal of recovery, at least before the recession of 1937-38. As such, it may well have prevented a total collapse of the capitalist economic system and the American democratic political system. Look in this regard at what happened in the rest of the world with the appeal and rise of fascism and communism. And while the New Deal did not accept and institute massive deficit spending as a permanent and viable feature of the budget and the economy, or redistribute wealth, or challenge the basics of capitalism, it did experiment. And in the process, it created a new role for government in people's lives and the modern American government and economy, the so-called welfare state. Now, the welfare state is not socialism. The economy remained in private rather than government hands, with the partial exception of the Tennessee Valley Authority. But the New Deal did establish a new regulatory state to oversee the capitalist economy and prevent another Great Depression. It also established a safety net for individuals within the capitalist system. As Roosevelt stated in this regard, quote, "Government has a final responsibility for the well-being of its citizenship. If private cooperative effort fails to provide work for willing hands and relief for the unfortunate, those suffering hardship through no fault of their own have the right to call upon the government for aid, and a government worthy of its name must make fitting response." That marked a fundamental shift in the role of government within this country. Historian David Kennedy sees coherence within the New Deal in this regard, the goal of security, stability. For good reason, Kennedy used one of Roosevelt's famous 1941 Four Freedoms as the title of his prize-winning book, which was a history of the United States from 1929 to 1945. The title, Freedom from Fear. And in that freedom from fear, the New Deal created a relatively riskless capitalism that kept it palatable to most Americans in their most difficult hours. The true legacy of the New Deal was thus not recovery, but reform. The New Deal also led to a massive expansion of the federal government, and with it, a massive expansion of the power of the president. Power shifted from Wall Street to Washington, with the president becoming the nation's chief economic engineer. But this had enormous negative as well as positive consequences. Two of the negative results were a hodgepodge economic system without coherency and a growth in executive and federal power that has proven quite dangerous to the constitutional system of checks and balances. And while the New Deal did not redistribute wealth, it clearly brought previously forgotten groups into American politics and cultural life. Labor, the elderly, the unemployed, and immigrant groups from Eastern and Southern Europe on both symbolic and real levels. The New Deal's pro-union stand also broke with previous government policy and helped to create the largest middle class in American history, as many industrial workers joined the middle class. And the gains for labor were not just financial. Steel mills, which used to have 12-hour shifts 7 days a week, shifted to 5-day, 40-hour weeks with paid vacations and sabbaticals. The New Deal's impact on agriculture was mixed. The aim to raise agricultural prices by cutting production succeeded to an extent, but this had a terrible impact on sharecroppers and tenant farmers in the South, white as well as black, and it did not succeed in raising prices to the so-called parity level of the World War I years. In addition, New Deal measures as well as the increased mechanization wound up increasing consolidation in agriculture and led to agribusiness. And those who survived this consolidation became a vested interest group dependent on federal aid. In this regard, and in other ways, the New Deal also created what has been labeled the broker state or interest group state, whereby groups would organize and pressure the government to get their piece of the pie. That in turn could be seen as a continuation of the organizational revolution from the progressive era in the 1920s. But groups that either could not or did not organize, such as migrant workers and tenant farmers, were left out in the cold. African Americans were both helped and hurt by many New Deal measures. Agricultural policies hurt black tenant farmers and led to them being evicted from the land in favor of expanded mechanization. But other New Deal measures, such as support for organized labor, helped those who moved north and organized. Roosevelt refused to support civil rights for blacks or even an anti-lynching bill because he wanted the votes of Southern white legislators for his New Deal. But the integrationist ethos of many New Dealers and the rise of a new generation of black leaders set the foundation for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which then had a ripple effect on other minorities. Women were similarly helped and hurt by the New Deal. On the positive side was their movement into the national political world, symbolized by the appointment of the first female cabinet member, Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor, and the incredible political activities of Eleanor Roosevelt, who redefined the role of First Lady. But from our 21st century perspective, the New Deal also reinforced traditional roles and stereotypes of women, as illustrated by the assumption in the Social Security bill that women could not support themselves and the societal belief that any woman in the workforce was taking away a man's job. The New Deal helped to reassert an ethic of social consciousness in the arts, letters, and society in general, and it pioneered in government patronage of the arts. It also firmly established the progressive concept of using experts in government and brought intellectuals